Hi class, this is Susan Priest again. This is the second Hinduism lecture. So the focus here is going to be looking at more specifics about philosophy and the texts of the religion, and then also explore how really Hinduism shows up as a variety of practices and beliefs. The first thing that I wanted to go over with all of you, some of you may or may not have had a philosophy 101 or some other philosophy class before. So, and you certainly do not need to have had one of those classes before taking this class, but I just want to go through two of the major categories of philosophy, because we're going to begin to see both in Hinduism and Buddhism and the other Eastern religions how they look at the questions of metaphysics and epistemology similarly and differently from Western philosophers and theologians. So the first big category is metaphysics. And metaphysics involve any kind of question related to being. What is the nature of reality? Is reality just a substance, or is reality non-material? So you're going to see that there's, within the category of non-materialists, the most common is a dualistic idea, and certainly Western philosophy that stems from Plato, the writings of Plato and Aristotle, and Descartes would be considered to be dualistic. The concept of having a spirit that's separate from the body is a dualistic concept. And you can see that throughout many Western traditions. But you can also see it in some Eastern traditions. There's also monism, a kind of unified theory idea. Now, I hinted at that with the first lecture on Hinduism, and you're going to see later that that idea is actually fully realized in the Upanishads. There were also Western philosophers who thought this, that everything is in the mind. That would be George Berkeley, who was from Great Britain, theologian and philosopher. So oftentimes religions are asking the question, what is reality? What is the universe? Why are we here? Right? Those are the big what questions. But actually, philosophy and religion also looks at the other second major discipline of philosophy, which is epistemology, which revolve around questions of knowledge. How do we know what we know? How do you know you're sitting there? Are you listening? How do you know that you're not really just on some planet, some other place, in a pod? So there are basically three different schools of thought in epistemological questions. The first school of thought, rationalism, which is like Plato and Descartes, who saw that we know things because we have some preconditions. We know some things ahead of time without having to experience them. It's almost as if we know it beforehand. That's why it's considered an a priori type of epistemology. The second type, which you're probably more familiar with, is a posteriori, or the scientific method best known as empiricism. We know because we see, we observe, and there we tap into, we're the heirs of Aristotle here. And then there is a skeptical worldview, which says we can't know things. We doubt things because we can't really know. So keep this in mind as we're looking at Hinduism, and then again Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism, because this will come up periodically, but it comes up especially when we're looking at the philosophy of the Upanishads. So historically speaking, we said Hinduism started with the Vedas, and the Vedas were highly ritualistic. There were rituals for everything. So sometime during the Axis Age, now this is a period of time that historians of religion refer to as the Axis Age because there were a lot of things happening on the planet simultaneously without people having conversations, like the Greek philosophers, Hindu philosophers, Buddhism, Jainism in India, Confucianism, Taoism, the Hebrew poets and prophets. So there was lots of things happening on the planet, and there was no evidence that they were communicating with each other. So we don't have any evidence that Plato was talking to some Hindu scholar. Just not happening. So one of the things that happened in India is that the caste system was very strong, and there were very specific rituals that people were supposed to adhere to. And after a while, some people began to say, hey, what's with all the ritual? And why do we have to be in caste? So there was a religion called, there is a religion called Jainism that was started by a fellow named Mahavira, and he lived a little bit before the Buddha, and he practiced nonviolence or ahimsa, and he started a nude order of monks. And they were people who, in India, they are known to be very virtuous and radical vegetarians. They might not even eat root vegetables because that might disturb an animal critter. But the Jains believed in reincarnation and some elements of Hindu philosophy, but they rejected the caste system. Similarly, Buddha and his followers also rejected the caste system. So we can see that these two offshoots, we could say that they're offshoots of Hinduism, really were reactions to the heavy-duty ritualism of the Vedas and the very strict caste system. But we can also see that within Hinduism there was kind of an internal renewal movement. And I know that you'll notice there's a slightly different dating here than what I gave you before. So these are kind of rough guidelines. So during this time of change and new ideas, the Upanishads were written down in dialogue form over hundreds of years. Now, interestingly enough, this has a lot in common with the writings of Plato, the Republic, many others, because they were written in dialogue form. But this was the format of the Upanishads. This is the format of the Upanishads. So there was a lot of critique of the sacrificial focus of the Vedic religion, but the Upanishads also introduced some major theological concepts. Brahman, Atman, Dharma, Moksha. We'll talk more about these in a minute. So, these are the main concepts that I'd really like you to understand. This isn't the only philosophy of Hinduism, but it represents Advaita Vedanta, the kind of monistic side of Hinduism that's really quite fascinating, that really changes it, and it moves away from dualism completely. So Brahman is absolute consciousness, transcendent reality. It's everything. Unity and infinity of the divine. So you'll see, I'll mention this again when we get to Taoism, but George Lucas, the creator of the whole Star Wars epics, all the Star Wars epics, looked at both Hinduism and Taoism when he was creating the notion of the Force. So in a sense, Brahman is like the Force. Now, be very careful. Don't confuse Brahman with Brahma, the creator of the universe, because Brahman is something else. Actually, Brahman, A-N, is bigger, more all-encompassing. So within the Upanishads, there was this recognition that human beings are born with a soul, an immortal self. It was kind of like the sacred within. So the Atman is part of every human's experience. And this is why Hindus say you're reincarnated, because you have a soul which is born again into a new realm of existence, a new life. So then we want to look at, well, how does this work? How does the whole reincarnation cycle work? So these concepts really help to understand that. So every human is born into the world and they have an Atman, a soul, and they have an experience of the world. And what the Hindus say is that all of our understanding of reality is colored or tinged by illusion, a kind of deception. So that includes categories of ignorance. Ignorance is an illusion or a delusion. But actually, the Hindus also say that knowledge is a delusion or illusion. So again, think about, this is very much like what Plato says in the myth of the cave. He says people are deceived by their senses. And this is what the Hindus are saying. Saying you can't really trust that what you see is what you get. So that's an important aspect of this philosophical school of thought. So karma is probably something most of you are familiar with. And the literal translation of the Sanskrit word karma means deed or act. And karma is the consequence of one's action that determines rebirth. And karma is created every time one acts. So you're born into the world, you're touched by this delusion of Maya, but you have to go about acting. And the point is, you want to do good things instead of bad things. But you're stuck on the journey of life, or samsara, the wheel of life, the wheel of life, death, and rebirth. So you might understand, kind of like the movie Groundhog Day, if every life you're going to be reincarnated in the next life, you might realize that the end of the journey is not just simply being reincarnated again, but somehow being liberated from the wheel of samsara. So the ultimate concept here is the concept of moksha, which literally means liberation. And and moksha is something that leads to the Atman not being reborn, but understanding that it is just part of Brahman, which contains everything. So this union of moksha is supreme over the three other goals. I know Houston Smith does a really good job of talking about how the Hindus say, hey, it's okay to want wealth, to want pleasure, to do your duty, right? That there's a cycle of life, and there's a time and a place for everything. But ultimately, the end game in Hinduism. It's not a, end of the world scenario. It is because the world keeps getting created and destroyed in all of the various yugas. But actually, the end game, according to the Upanishads, is becoming one with Brahman, which you already are in the first place. So it's typical when Hindus bow to each other. It's like the Atman in me is bowing to the Atman in you, or the Atman in one person is bowing to the Atman in another person. So I just want to just spend just another second looking at this. I clicked too soon. So these 6 concepts work together as a system. So they're best understood as a system. So you might be thinking about how you could tell someone about this, because I think that's an important way of understanding these concepts. And again, it's a monistic version of a monistic metaphysics with a rational / skeptical epistemology. Very interesting. So there are 2 epic poems in Hinduism that kind of get created, it looks like over 600 to 800 year time span. So the Mahabharata is an epic tale of civil war between the 2 cousins, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And we have this picture here taken from the 18th chapter of the Mahabharata, called the Bhagavad Gita. And this is highlighted as sort of the most evolved, self-realized conversation in there. And there's a conversation between Krishna and Arjuna before Arjuna has to go to battle against his cousins, the Kauravas. So the whole setup is that the deal is there's 2 sets of cousins who are leaders or rulers of this particular land. And the Kauravas are in power, and they're supposed to give up their power to the Pandavas. Well, no surprise, the Kauravas do not want to just hand over power to the Pandavas. So Krishna, who's a Pandava, has to go to battle against his cousins, and he really doesn't want to. So it brings up all of the themes of passion and duty and honor. It's just fascinating. And there's all sorts of different ways to look at the Bhagavad Gita. People read it as a document for just war. They read it as a document for peace. So there's all sorts of elements of philosophy, even the philosophy of the Upanishads, in the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita. The second epic, the Ramayana, has a different character who is the incarnation of Vishnu. So in the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita, it is Krishna who appears as the incarnation of Vishnu. But in the Ramayana, it's Rama, Lord Rama, who appears as the incarnation of Vishnu. And it's kind of a love story, another battle between good and evil, though, in the Ramayana. Very interesting. One of the first English translations of the Ramayana from Sanskrit to English was done by a young man who taught himself Sanskrit at the Nevada State Library in the 1950s. Check it out. So Houston Smith talks about this, but I just want to again say that the texts that are studied are elements of the religion, but it's different from, let's say, Christianity, Judaism and Islam, where there's a single text that everyone studies. So some of the elements of Hinduism you can see in different parts. Now, the 4 stages of life is a practice that was common. It's, I would say, probably a little less common now, but it's a helpful way of understanding how Hinduism developed. So, in its beginnings, through many centuries, at least through the 19th century for sure, and parts of the 20th century, it was believed that the upper caste men, so this was only relevant to people who were already twice born. So if the conviction was you were twice born if you were either of the Kshatriya or the Brahmin caste, this would only apply to men in that category, young men in that category. But for twice born, the goal of life as a young person was to be a student, to study religion. And it was characterized by celibacy and obedience. So you weren't supposed to be sleeping around or doing anything like that, just studying. But then, a little bit later in life, 20s on up, 20s to 40s and 50s, the second phase, the grihastha phase, or the householder phase, the goal of the holy life for the twice-born male was to marry and raise a family. So, perfectly normal to want to make money and buy nice things and have a family and buy your family nice things. Increase building knowledge, goods. And during this period of the householder phase is also when men went to do public service. So this is the time that they went to be statesmen. Interestingly enough, in political philosophy in India, there weren't elder statesmen like we have as a tradition in U.S. and Great Britain, where someone who is very an elder really is still has a lot of political power. And the reason for this is because the third stage of life for Hindus was to retire. And so the idea was that once you got to retirement age, your goal was to get away from society, go to the forest, and it's where you had more time for extended family and religion, but you were not doing householder things or political activity. Then finally, the last stage of life in Hinduism is the sannyasin phase, or the renunciate phase, where the goal is to give up everything and work toward liberation, or moksha, which is again characterized by celibacy and freedom from possessions and attachments. So again, the sannyasin phase might be something that only a rare number of men would go through. But this becomes especially important when we get to the origin story of the Buddha. You'll see. The other practice of yoga, which Houston Smith rightly points out as a different kind of practice, is the practice of yoga. Now, most of you are going to think of yoga as just some kind of physical exercise, because that's mostly how it's known in the West. But that's actually a misunderstanding of what yoga is about. Yoga means to join or to yoke with the divine. So these different yogas are different pathways to the divine. The first kind of yoga is knowledge yoga, or jnana yoga. An example here is the philosopher Shankara, who wrote in the 8th century that all is one. So Shankara is one of the universalists, like Ramakrishna. Now, the most prevalent form of yoga in India, in Hinduism, is Bhakti yoga, which is devotional yoga, prayers, chants, rituals, homage to deities who are basically just different aspects of Brahman. There's also karma yoga, which is talked about quite a bit in the Bhagavad Gita. There's a great selection you might choose to read for your next essay on selfless action and what it means to act without wanting reward. That is the essence of karma yoga. Raja yoga is meditation yoga. So it's said, the Hindu philosophers say that the mind is like a bunch of drunken monkeys having a party. And the only way to quiet the drunken monkeys is through meditation. So the practice of the physical practice of yoga actually helps prepare the body for the royal discipline of Raja yoga. And then the last kind of yoga is really the physical exercises, hatha yoga, which is a force or physical exercise. And actually, hatha yoga is really not a path to the divine all on its own. It really is supplementary to the others, most definitely Raja yoga. So the Bhakti movement, again, is the most prevalent form of yoga, and there's three basic divisions within these Bhakti movements. They tended to either be about worshiping the Saktas, worshiping the divine feminine, the mother goddess, all aspects of all the female deities like Durga and Kali and Sarasvati. And then the Shaivites focuses on the aspect of Shiva and his son Ganesha. And one of the rituals, again, because Shiva is associated with sexuality and fertility, one of the rituals for the Shaivites is the use of the Yoni Lingam. And here we have one that depicts one of the images of Shiva. So it's actually supposed to be a combination of both male and female genitalia, and there are certain rituals, like one ritual where there's a puja where someone pours milk over the Yoni Lingam in a respectful manner. Then there's the Vaishnavites, and they are the ones who worship different aspects or different incarnations of Vishnu. So people who are following Krishna or Rama. Now there's so many different Hindu festivals. I mean, there's at least 16 major Hindu festivals, probably more. But the daily ritual, which either happens at home or at the temple, is called a puja. And that's kind of a general term for a respectful, worshipful ritual. And again, sometimes it's done in people's homes, and sometimes it's done at temples. And certainly there are specific rituals on festival days. But finally, it really is important to see that the many paths of Sanatana Dharma is not just about worshiping gods and goddesses. In fact, there are some Hindus who don't really spend any time worshiping gods and goddesses and just read the sacred texts. They find truth through meditation, and they practice ethical behavior through nonviolence, ahimsa, and other paths. And the idea that suffering is caused by people's ignorance of their true nature. So this does not get talked about as much, but I did want to just mention that because not all of Hinduism is really understood by the monistic ideas of the Upanishads that I was talking to you earlier about. But there's actually an earlier tradition, Samkhya, which is more dualistic. And again, you can see this idea of physical matter versus spirit. So the dualism here is the difference between Purusha, who is the eternal self, wise and beyond change. Again, a Westerner might see that as God, or, the divine. Whereas the opposite of that, or intention with that, is prakriti. Prakriti is the cause of the material universe, so all material substance, which is seemed to bring about happiness, but also delusion. So the problem comes in when people think they can find themselves within the material world. And this is really what Hinduism says. If you look at the path of the different yogas, if you look at the path of the twice-born men who go through the 4 stages, you can see that there's a common goal, which is whatever you're searching for in life, you're not going to find the ultimate happiness just by having the most stuff. You're just not. Or you're lying to yourself. That's a basic idea of Hinduism. And again, just as review, the concepts of Brahman, Atman, karma, Maya, samsara, and moksha all make up the monistic or unified philosophical system of the Upanishads, which is referred to as Advaita Vedanta, which means non-dualistic thinking. So both sets of ideas are true in Hinduism. Very interesting. So finally, if we want to look at modern Hinduism, first of all, in modern Hinduism, the caste system has been outlawed. It still seems to operate culturally, but strictly speaking, it's against the law. It seems like there's still quite a bit of tension between factions of Hinduism that are more nationalistic and exclusive. Like there's some Hindu nationalists who just want to kill all the Muslims. And those branches of Hinduism which see that there are many paths to God, and maybe even not all the Hindu ones are the only ones. They acknowledge a kind of universalism. There's also some people might be introduced to Hinduism through Paramahansa Yogananda's The Autobiography of a Yogi. There's quite a center up in Sierra Nevada foothills. Trying to think of the name of the town, and I'm blanking on it. It'll come to me probably after I finish recording this, but the Transcendental Meditation movement was actually started after people learning certain meditation techniques from a very famous Maharishi. And then the Krishna worshippers, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, also sometimes referred to as Hare Krishnas. These are all sort of spin-off movements from Hinduism, we could say. But it's interesting, and relatively recently, the Indian Supreme Court came up with a definition of Hinduism. We can see that they seem to opt more for universalism than exclusivism. They had 7 tenets. First being the acceptance and reverence for Vedas. The second being a spirit of tolerance of different ideas. The third being acceptance of vast cosmic periods of creation and destruction. These are referred to as the yugas. Acceptance of belief in reincarnation. Fifth, paths to truth and salvation are many. There may be numerous gods and goddesses to worship without believing in worship of idols. And there is an absence of belief in a specific set of concepts, philosophical concepts. So, tell me what you think. I look forward to talking to you more about Hinduism.